On the morning of May 8, 1945, the sun rose over Arizona as it always did, heating the iron-grey roofs of the Papago Park camp until the metal seemed ready to blister. Carl Schmidt stood in formation while the camp commander, voice dry and emptied of feeling, announced that the war was over. From beyond the wire came a faint cheer from the city, muffled as if heard through thick glass. Around Carl, the men in worn olive drab with PW stitched on their chests did not move. No one wept. No one embraced. No one even showed obvious relief. A silence heavier than defeat settled over the desert compound. Carl was 23. Before capture, he had been an ordinary signalman in the German army from Hamburg. His war had ended on a muddy hillside in northern Italy almost a year earlier. Since then, he had lived in a dry, hot country where everything ran against the grain of home. Food was sufficient. There were no bombs. The labor was hard but predictable. He had learned to say good morning and thank you in heavily accented English. Time in the camp had lost its direction until the word ended came down like a hammer and shattered the glass dome that had been holding his life in place. What rushed in afterward was not liberation, but confusion. The camp entered a strange stretch of agitation and stasis at once. The official line was waiting for repatriation arrangements. Days passed. No ships, no trains. Only the rations shifted. Less fresh meat, more cans. Rumors moved through the barracks like desert wind, finding every crack. Some said the Americans and British were arguing over who would pay to transport them. Some said Germany's ports were rubble and could not receive anyone. Others whispered something darker. Perhaps the victors would keep them here forever or ship them to Siberia. Carl began to dream the same dream. In it, he ran through St. Pauli on the cobblestone street he knew by heart. But every house was torn open. Walls were pocked through. Windows were black holes. In the middle of the street rose a mountain of shattered brick and timber, unrecognizable as anything that had once been ordinary. He called his parents' names. Only the wind answered. He woke in the Arizona night with sweat cooling on his skin. The first letter from home arrived at the end of May. It was not the neat handwriting he remembered from his mother. The letters trembled and crowded every corner as if the paper itself were scarce. "My dear Carl," she wrote, "thank God you are alive. Can this letter even reach you? I pray every day. Hamburg is terrible, very terrible. Our street is lucky. The building still stands, but there has been no glass for more than a year. We nailed boards over the windows. Your father's shipyard is completely destroyed. He walks far every day to work with a clearing crew. His pay is a few carrots or a handful of moldy potatoes. The ration cards are not enough. The black market prices are unimaginable. Last winter was so cold, coal was like gold. Many got sick and did not get up again. Mrs. Meyer next door, you remember her. Her youngest boy was on the Eastern Front. She did not make it past Christmas. Carl, if you have any way at all, take care of yourself. Do not rush to come back. There is no hope here, at least not now." Carl read the letter until the paper softened in his hands. Each sentence pierced the last warm fantasy he still carried about home. He went to the barrack window. Outside lay bright desert noon, and farther off the Johnson farm. Irrigated alfalfa fields, canals crossing like stitched seams, the green under the sun so vivid it hurt. On one side was the ruin his mother described with certainty. Cold, hungry, hopeless. On the other was this foreign place, loud with life and abundance. The contrast cut into him like a guilty blade. The camp began to split along invisible lines. Men like Hans Bauer, Carl's bunkmate, a blunt young infantryman from a Bavarian farm, insisted they would go back no matter what. "That's my home," Hans said during night arguments, his face flushed. "My parents, my sister are there. Even if it's rubble, it's my rubble. I have to clear bricks and build a roof again. Stay here and farm for Americans? We lost. Do we have to beg on the enemy's land too?" Others thought about different possibilities. Erich von Berlichingen, older and practical, had been an engineer officer before capture. During a break from labor, he sat in the shade and spoke as if reading from a ledger. "Look at the numbers," he told Carl and the men nearby. City housing destroyed, industry crippled, agriculture failing. Going back means 5 to 10 years of hunger, cold, no work. Here the war barely touched their homeland. They have food, factories, and a shortage of labor. Staying might be hard, but the odds of survival and improvement are better. This isn't sentiment, it's arithmetic. Carl was caught between them. He understood Hans's loyalty, the pull of blood and memory. It lived in the same place as Carl's dream of that street, but he could not dismiss Eric's calculation, especially when his mother's letter served as a brutal footnote. He began to watch their American employer more closely, Old Man Johnson. Johnson was the archetype of an Arizona rancher. Few words, every wrinkle carved by desert wind. Carl heard from other hands that Johnson's only son had died in the Ardennes. Johnson never spoke of it. He was not kind to the POW laborers, but he was strict and fair. Work well and you earned full credit, tradable for cigarettes or extra sugar. Slack off and you drew immediate scolding. Once Carl repaired a tractor engine Johnson had wrestled with for half a day. Johnson watched the machine roar back to life, then handed Carl an unopened pack of Camels. "Not bad hands," he said. Nothing more. In early July, on an afternoon so hot even the cicadas sounded tired, Carl and Johnson serviced an irrigation pump. The pump sat deep. Carl climbed down into the slick well to check the impeller. When the trouble was cleared, he crawled back up, soaked and coated in mud. Johnson handed him a canteen and watched him drink. "I got a notice," Johnson said, eyes on the far horizon shimmering in heat. "Next month they're sending a batch of you out. East Coast port, then on a ship." Carl's stomach tightened. "The list," he managed. Johnson's gaze settled on him, steady and unreadable. "I saw it. Your name's on it, Schmidt." The pump hummed. Carl felt the moment narrow, as if the world had been pressed into a thin strip of sound and heat. "My boy," Johnson said, still in that flat tone. "When he died, he was about your age. Good kid. Couldn't fix a tractor to save his life." He paused. "My ranch needs men who can work, men you can rely on. After the war, it needs them more than ever. The government has a lot of paperwork. But if a man like you wants to stay, as a worker, not as a prisoner, there are ways. Sponsor, files, investigation. It's a nuisance, but there are ways." Carl stared at him. This was no longer a barracks argument or a rumor. This was a key with weight and heat from a living hand offered without ceremony. It was attached to a road Carl had thought about only in shadow. "Why me?" Carl asked, voice dry. Johnson shrugged, a heavy motion worn by years. "Because you work. Because you fixed my pump. Because you don't look like you've still got madness in your head. Because land needs tending. War's over, but life keeps going, that's all." He dusted his work pants. "You don't have to answer now. You've got a few weeks before the ship. Think. But once you decide, there's no turning back. Not for you, not for me." That night, the barracks turned sharp with argument. Hans's disbelief hardened into anger. "He's buying you," he said, "buying you with a job, pulling you away from your country and your responsibility. You want to be a traitor? You want people whispering, 'That German stayed for a few dollars'?" Eric kept his voice level. "It's an opportunity, Carl, a real one. Johnson has standing. If it works, you get legal status, you can work, and you can help your family in a way you cannot from a ruin. Maybe you can bring them over someday." Others watched Carl with eyes he could not read. Envy, contempt, curiosity, and distance. He felt himself splitting. One side held Hans and the heavy world of blood, memory, and shame. The other held Eric's world of odds and future. Between them sat Johnson's offer, real enough to cut. Carl did not sleep. Images came in waves, his mother shivering behind boarded windows, his father bent under bricks, Hamburg harbor warehouses he knew by heart, now broken walls, the endless green alfalfa under merciless sun, Johnson's eyes, dulled by grief into a hard calm, Hans's face, young and furious. A few days later, the camp posted the first repatriation list. Hans's name stood plainly on it. On the eve of departure, the two young soldiers spoke under a sky thick with stars. The shouting was gone. What remained was grief that felt nearly solid. "I'm going back," Hans said, voice rough. "I'll find my family. I'll rebuild, 10 years, 20 years, whatever it takes. That's our place, Carl. Even broken. It's ours. Carl looked up. The Arizona sky held no familiar patterns from his childhood in Hamburg. I don't know, Hans. My mother's letter. There's no fuel left for normal. If I stay, I can at least send money, food. Maybe someday there's a way to bring them out. Isn't that also a kind of rebuilding? Hans was quiet for a long time. It's not the same, he said. Then it's not Germany anymore. And you're not German anymore. You'll be someone with no roots. He gripped Carl's shoulder hard, farewell packed into the pressure. Take care. Whatever you choose, for God's sake, don't regret it. The next morning, the repatriation group climbed into olive-drab trucks. Hans turned, found Carl in the crowd, and looked once, long and deep. He did not wave. He boarded. The convoy kicked up dust and drove toward an unknown road home. Carl stayed until the dust settled and there was no trace left. A part of him felt as if it had ridden away. A few days later, Carl found Johnson in the barn. "Sir," he said, surprised by the steadiness of his own voice, "if that sponsorship is still real, I want to try." Johnson studied him, then nodded. "All right. Tomorrow we go into town. Lawyer forms. It'll be a long road, Schmidt, and what happens along it nobody knows." The process was as miserable as promised. Forms without end, details demanded down to every step of his service, documents he could not produce, birth papers turned to ash in Hamburg's bombings. Immigration officials studied him with suspicion. Why stay in America? Any loyalty to the Nazi regime? How prove you were no threat? Background checks reached toward childhood friends and school teachers, people who might already be dead. While he waited, the camp emptied. One group after another left for the port and boarded ships for Europe. Every farewell carved a new mark in him. He had chosen a different path, and with it stepped into a lonely whirl of uncertainty. When autumn came, Carl moved out of the camp and into a small, unused house on Johnson's land as a paroled alien agricultural worker. Legally, he was still in between. Physically, everything changed. No roll calls, a kerosene lamp at night for reading, wages he could spend in town on a sturdy pair of jeans. Freedom seeped into his life in small, concrete measures. The war inside him did not stop. He woke at night with doubts. When the radio carried reports about the occupation zones, pain tightened in his chest. When newspapers printed photographs of Europe's refugees, he wondered if he was the most shameful kind, the one who chose to flee. He wrote home and sent money, his last thin connection. His mother's replies stayed short and full of hardship, but always ended with the same line, "Knowing you are safe is our comfort." In the spring of 1946, immigration notified him of a final hearing in 2 months. Johnson told him the odds were even. "Depends on the mood," Johnson said. "Depends on the man behind the desk. Depends on luck." A few weeks before that hearing, Carl learned how fragile luck could be. One Saturday evening, he went to the town's general store for supplies and met a few drunk American soldiers from a nearby base. They heard his accent and decided it was entertainment. "Hey, look," one said, tall and red-headed, blocking him. "A German. Ain't you all supposed to be heading home?" Then, louder, meaner. "Heard you guys like your camps, like killing Jews." People glanced over. No one stepped in. Carl felt heat flood his head. His fists tightened. He remembered training, the quick violence of the battlefield. He also remembered the file bearing his name, the hearing date fixed in his mind, his mother's plea, "Take care of yourself." He forced his face to relax. "I'm sorry," he said as steadily as he could, his accent thickening. "I'm only here to buy things." The soldier stared, disappointed by the lack of a fight, muttered something ugly, and moved aside. Carl walked into the store with his back straight. In the shadowed corner where no one could see, his fingers shook. In that moment he understood. Even if he stayed, even if he got the paper, he would always be the German. The road he had chosen was thorned from the start, lined with invisible walls. A week before the hearing, a parcel arrived from his mother. Inside was a hand-knit sweater, the stitches loose, the yarn poor and grey. A note lay on top. "Bought the yarn with the money you sent. I hope it fits. Hamburg winter is coming again, but we are all well. Praying for you. Love, your mother." Carl held the sweater to his chest. It smelled of dust and old paper, not of home. Still, it was the first physical thing from home he had touched in years. It was fragile and almost nothing, and yet it weighed like stone. The night before the hearing, Carl sat on his porch steps under a cold desert sky. The Milky Way stretched overhead, vast and indifferent. He thought of Hans somewhere in Germany, facing the ruins he had sworn to rebuild. He thought of Erich, rumored to have gone east under a construction company's sponsorship, fighting his own battle to stay. He thought of the hundreds of men from the camp, scattered now across the world. And he thought of himself, a former signalman, clutching a sweater from a shattered city, waiting for tomorrow's 10 minutes to decide the shape of the rest of his life. The hearing itself was brief. Bright room, tired middle-aged officer, thick files, routine questions. Why stay? What did you know of the Constitution? Would you obey the law and avoid subversion? Carl answered in the English he had drilled until his tongue ached, short and clear, still heavily accented. Johnson sat as sponsor and said only, "He's a good worker. Honest, quiet." The officer flipped papers, scratched a pen across the page, then signed and stamped. "Temporary residence permit," he said. 1 year, renewal review each year. After 5 years, if your record is good, you may apply for permanent residence. Congratulations, Mr. Schmidt. You are now a lawful resident alien." Outside, Arizona sunlight struck like a wave. Carl held the thin paper with its blurred photograph and felt no joy, only exhaustion that ran deep. This was not an ending and not a beginning. It was a conditional pass, a step from one in-between into another. The battlefield had shifted from whether he could stay to how he would stay and what kind of person he would become while doing so. He became a formal hired hand on Johnson's ranch with steady weekly wages. He added to the small house piece by piece, a sturdier bed, a second-hand bookcase, proper tools. He learned to drive Johnson's old Ford into town for parts and supplies. People came to know him as the German at Johnson's place who works like a mule. Most kept a polite distance, nodding hello without asking much. Sometimes he still caught the weighing look in a bar or a hardware store when the radio played war news, a reminder that his accent carried history with it. The biggest change was language. Carl studied English as if it were another kind of machinery. Textbooks, local newspaper, words learned one by one under the kerosene lamp. Mrs. Johnson corrected his pronunciation when she felt kind enough to do it. He missed jokes and stumbled through slang, living as if half-deaf to the world's subtleties. The loneliness of that was sometimes sharper than hunger. Germany remained a thin lifeline. His mother's letters were sporadic and spare, full of hard facts. Rations cut, his father's cough worse in winter, potatoes on the black market absurdly expensive. Every month Carl sent money, never large, but still a quarter of his wages. He wrote short notes. Please use this for food and medicine. He feared censors and feared his own emotions. He became a distant provider, present through money orders and measured lines. Year by year, the permit renewals came. Each time an officer reviewed his tax record, Johnson's sponsorship letter, a statement from the town sheriff that he had no undesirable behavior, and then stamped another year onto his life. Time stopped feeling like the camp's flat repetition. It became made of harvests, repairs, and small improvements, reading a little faster, understanding a radio broadcast a little more, seeing in his mother's letters the first hints of easing. In 1948, the Marshall Plan was in the news, and Carl read what he could, trying to translate large numbers into a picture of home. His mother wrote that streets were being cleared, a few shops reopened, though shelves were thin. That same year, with Johnson's encouragement and a small loan, Carl rented 10 rough acres at the edge of the ranch. He wanted something of his own, even if the paper said it was temporary. He cleared brush, fought for water, and worked after hours until his hands blistered. The work was punishing, but it did something his permits could not. It let him imagine routes. Around then, he met Eleanor, the town librarian. She was in her early 30s, quiet and thoughtful, with a habit of listening as if she had time. Carl became a regular for farm manuals and dictionaries. Eleanor did not react to his accent with curiosity or pity. She recommended books, corrected a word now and then, and treated him like a man learning, not a symbol of a finished war. Coffee came later, then a few evenings at the small-town theatre. The relationship grew slowly, like desert plants. One night after dinner, walking her to her apartment, Eleanor said what others avoided. "You never talk about the war, Carl. And you never talk about your family in Germany. He did not answer quickly. I don't know how, he said at last. It feels like another world, broken, full of guilt. Sometimes I feel like my life here is built on sand. Under it there are holes, memories I can't fill. Eleanor took his hand. Whether there are holes underneath depends on what you put there, she said. If you only put memories, it stays empty. If you put in the present and things the future might hold, then maybe it stands. That sentence stayed with him because it was simple and because it did not excuse him. It asked for work. In 1950, Karl filed his application for permanent residency. The world had shifted. The Berlin airlift was fresh in memory, the Cold War lines hardening, Germany slowly moving in American eyes from enemy to front line. Karl's file was thicker now, years of taxes, a clean record, character letters from community members, proof he was working his 10 acres. He also had an American tie that mattered to officials. He and Eleanor were engaged. The hearing was serious and short. Questions about democracy, about loyalty to law, about what America meant to him. Karl answered with blunt honesty. He hated tyranny. He valued work. He was grateful for a second chance. He wanted to belong by conduct. The approval came. That night, he and Eleanor opened a cheap bottle of champagne in her small apartment and clinked glasses quietly. Karl felt something settle. He could stay without yearly terror. That fall, they married in the town's small church with the Johnsons as witnesses. Karl wrote to his parents. His mother's reply was joyful and aching at once, a blessing and the quiet grief of absence. She enclosed a yellowed wedding photograph of his parents, stiff smiles on a Hamburg street that no longer existed in the same way. Karl showed the picture to Eleanor. Hamburg was still whole then, he said. Eleanor touched the photo as if it might crack. They must be glad you're settled, she said. In 1952, their son was born. Naming him became a small argument that revealed larger currents. Eleanor wanted a purely American name. Karl wanted a thread back to what had made him. They chose Michael Karl Schmidt. When Karl held the infant, soft and warm and smelling of milk, love rose with a fear he did not know how to confess. This boy would be fully American, and Karl would have to explain a past that did not fit neatly into bedtime stories. The 1950s moved in work and relative calm. Karl's 10 acres began to thrive. He tried grapes suited to the desert and learned by failure and stubborn repetition. Johnson aged and leaned on Karl's judgment more and more, their relationship shifting from employer and worker toward something close to family. Karl kept sending money to Germany. The letters grew less frequent, but his mother's replies arrived with steady rhythm, and slowly the tone changed. New houses going up. His father retired with a small pension, new cars appearing on the streets. Home rebuilt became a place that was both familiar and increasingly strange. In 1959, a telegram came from his father. Mother died peacefully. Father. Karl shut himself in the tool shed for a day and did not come out. The grief was heavy and blunt, and beneath it ran a colder sensation. The thread to Germany had been cut at its strongest point. He wrote to his father and begged him to consider coming to America. His father refused. My roots are here, he wrote. You were right to go. I am proud, but I belong here. Hug Michael for me. In the 1960s, Karl became a U.S. citizen. The oath felt less like a transformation than a confirmation of what daily life had already made true. After the ceremony, he took Eleanor and 10-year-old Michael to a restaurant, and Michael asked excited questions about voting and presidents. Karl answered and watched his son's face, purely American, unburdened by the story that had carried his father across an ocean. The older Karl grew, the more he felt the fatigue of living between worlds. In a small network of former POW immigrants, he was the American, talking taxes and crops. In town meetings and school events, he was still the German accent and past following him like a shadow. In the early 1970s, his father died. Karl flew to Germany for the funeral, returning after nearly 30 years. Hamburg was almost unrecognizable. New buildings, widened roads, traffic and light where his memory held ruins. Only an occasional scarred wall preserved as a memorial snapped the past into focus. Relatives were warm but distant, studying him as an American cousin. German on his tongue felt stiff. At his parents' grave, Karl stood for a long time and understood that the last anchor had slipped away. Germany was no longer home. It was the place where his past was buried. The trip did not heal him, but it released a weight. Germany had rebuilt. His parents' last years had not been only misery, and he saw with clarity that his life was in Arizona. The vineyard, Eleanor, Michael. Time kept moving. Michael went to college, studied engineering, and built a career in the East. The vineyard stayed small but steady, enough for a decent life. Johnson died and the ranch was sold to developers, but Karl held on to his 10 acres and the house. He and Eleanor adjusted to the quieter rooms of an empty nest. Karl's accent never disappeared. It became a feature, no longer an emergency. In the late 1980s, Michael came home with his fiancée, a bright third-generation Italian-American. At dinner she asked, curious and polite, where Karl was from and when he had immigrated. The table paused in a delicate silence. Eleanor looked at Karl. Michael watched him tense. Karl set down his fork and answered in slow, clear English. "I'm from Hamburg. I came to America in 1944 as a prisoner of war. After the war ended, I decided to stay." The young woman's eyes widened, then softened into careful politeness. "That must have been very difficult." "Yes," Karl said, "for everyone involved." He did not give details. Some stories were too heavy for a first meeting over dinner. Some wounds only time could turn into something that could be held without spilling. Later, after she left, Michael sat with his father on the porch. "Dad," he said, "thank you. I never knew how to talk about your past." "There's nothing to hide," Karl said. "It just took me a long time to learn how to live alongside it." Michael hesitated, then asked the question he had carried for years. "Do you regret it? Regret staying?" Karl listened to the night wind and the distant hush of the desert. "Regret is a big word," he said. "I miss things I lost, every day. But I value what I gained here. You, your mother, this land, this quiet life. If I went back to that morning on Victory Day, after my mother's letter, after looking into Mr. Johnson's eyes, I think I would choose the same. It wasn't a right or wrong choice, Michael. It was one of a few roads, and all of them were hard. I chose the one I believed I could keep walking." He added softer. "Our generation was scattered by war like sand. Some fell back where they started. Some fell into places they never imagined. Then they grew there. I grew here. My roots may not be deep. They may be twisted. But they did sink in. Time entered the new century. Karl and Eleanor grew old. Michael married, and his son Benjamin was born. Karl became a grandfather. Through a computer screen and blurred video calls, he watched a child living in a world that felt like another planet behind frosted glass. Benjamin called him Opa, a single German word Michael taught him. Beyond that, the boy's world held no ruins, no identity struggle, only possibility, and the small selfishness of being loved too much. Karl felt relief that was complicated and honest. In 2010, Eleanor died first, peacefully in her sleep. Karl stayed alone in the house they had shared for 60 years. The vineyard was mostly managed by a nearby farmer now. Karl kept a small section to tend himself, to keep his body moving. He read, sorted old things, and wrote long emails to Michael, slowly and carefully. Cleaning Eleanor's desk, he found a scrapbook she had kept in perfect condition. Inside were his early love letters, clumsy sentences he had once been ashamed of, the hospital wristband from Michael's birth, family photos, copies of early money orders, and his mother's shaky letters. Eleanor had sealed them in clear sleeves and added brief notes in her neat handwriting, naming what he had rarely named aloud. Karl turned the pages and cried without sound. In her quiet way, she had accepted all of him. The past he could not undo, the guilt he could not fully discharge, the silence he often used as armor. She had protected his history the way someone protects fragile specimens, not to display them, but to keep them from shattering. In his last years, Karl moved more slowly, but his mind stayed clear. He organized his papers, as if making an inventory for departure. Citizenship documents, deeds, tax records, copies of letters, old photographs. One quiet afternoon, sunlight through the blinds laid striped shadows across the living room floor. Carl sat in his favorite old armchair holding the only complete family photograph from before the war, taken in front of their Hamburg home. In it, he was a boy in a suit that did not fit, standing stiffly between parents who looked serious and solid. The building behind them was intact. The street was calm. He studied it for a long time. Then he lifted his head and looked through the window toward his small row of grapevines, bright in the sun. New shoots were pushing out, green and alive. 2 worlds, 2 photographs. Between them, a war, an ocean, and an entire lifetime. He closed his eyes. There was no fear, only a deep, tired calm. He thought of Hans and wondered whether he had rebuilt his Bavarian home. He thought of Eleanor's gentle eyes. He thought of Michael and Benjamin, faces full of life. He thought of Arizona's scorching wind and Hamburg's cold, damp fog. He made his choice. He paid the price. He built a life. He left a trace. The war had ended long ago. But the wars of survival, of belonging, of love, everyone fights them quietly for a whole life. Before the last thread of light vanished, he seemed to hear again that young voice under the Arizona stars in 1945, speaking to himself, "Whatever you decide, for God's sake, don't regret it." And he answered softly inside his own heart, "I don't regret it. I only walked my road." Outside, the grapevines swayed lightly in the breeze. The desert remained. The sky stayed wide. A new season was coming, unstoppable.